The mall has always been my little refuge after a long day at work. There's something about the buzz of conversations, the smell of pretzels baking, the shine of store windows. It just makes me breathe easier. That afternoon, I walked in with a sense of calm, lighter on my feet than usual. My mission was clear: find the perfect birthday gift for my mother. Not just anything, but something thoughtful, something that would make her smile the way only she can. I live for these small rituals. They remind me that even when life gets messy, there are pieces of it I can control. I stopped at a cafe, the cozy one tucked between two stores, and ordered my usual cappuccino. The first sip warmed me instantly, the foam brushing against my lip like a soft little luxury. I sat by the glass wall, watching people hurry past, teenagers laughing, moms tugging toddlers along, a couple bickering over shopping bags. I couldn't help but smile, feeling like I was part of some bigger rhythm, yet safely in my own bubble. For a moment, I felt grounded, like life was exactly where it needed to be. With my coffee finished and my mother's gift neatly wrapped in a bag swinging from my hand, I headed to the parking lot. The air was warm, carrying that faint, almost metallic smell of asphalt cooling after the heat of the day. I even caught myself humming a tune I'd heard on the radio earlier. Everything felt light, almost perfect. But then I turned a corner, and my breath hitched. Just a few rows away, I spotted a car I knew too well, my husband's. At first, I thought maybe I was mistaken. There are plenty of cars like his, I told myself, even though I could spot that dented bumper anywhere. My pace slowed, my heart tapping harder in my chest. What were the odds he'd be here? David had told me he was working late all week, drowning in meetings. I shook my head, pushing down the sudden rush of unease. I wanted to hold on to the calm I'd felt just moments ago. I clutched the gift bag tighter, its sharp edges pressing into my palm, almost grounding me. My mind tried to rationalize. Maybe he'd just stopped quickly. Maybe he wasn't even here anymore. But the sight of that car rooted me to the spot. I couldn't just walk past, not without knowing. It was as if the universe had pulled me into this exact spot at this exact moment, daring me to look closer. And yet, a part of me prayed I wouldn't have to. I stood there in the middle of the lot, the hum of engines and the sound of shopping carts rattling in the distance blending into background noise. The warmth I'd carried from my cafe stop now felt heavy, stifling. My skin tingled with unease, and I could feel the calm of my perfect day slipping away. Something inside whispered that my life was about to tilt in a way I wasn't ready for. I started walking slowly, each step deliberate, as though the ground beneath me had suddenly turned fragile. My eyes stayed fixed on that car, every detail etched sharper the closer I got. My heartbeat was no longer steady. It was wild, uncontained, like it already knew something my mind refused to accept. I wanted to believe it was nothing, that I'd laugh at myself later for overthinking. But deep down, I felt a shadow creeping in. The mall's fluorescent lights spilled into the lot, catching the glossy black paint of David's car. I stopped a few rows away, close enough to know without a doubt it was his. My throat tightened, the easy hum of my song replaced with silence. The gift bag felt heavier now, almost ridiculous in my hand. A birthday present for my mother, wrapped with care, suddenly seemed so small against the storm rising in me. I stood still, frozen between the ordinary day I'd had and the unraveling that was just beginning. My gut twisted, torn between turning back and stepping closer. Something told me that whatever happened next would split my life into a before and after. And as I lingered there, heart racing, I didn't yet know just how right that feeling was. I froze when I saw the driver's door open. For a split second, my brain begged me to look away, to turn and leave before the truth spilled out. But my eyes locked on the figure stepping out. It was David, my husband. The man who said he was buried in work, too busy for even a quick dinner with me. My chest tightened so suddenly it was hard to breathe. And then she appeared. A woman slid out of the passenger seat, laughing softly as she adjusted the strap of her dress. The sound of her voice carried across the lot, light and easy, like they had shared a private joke. I felt my stomach drop as if the ground had opened beneath me. She leaned closer to him, her hand brushing against his sleeve like it belonged there. I could barely process it. Before I could even blink, David bent down and kissed her, quick, casual, familiar. My whole body went cold, like ice rushing through my veins. I wanted to scream, to run, to make it all stop, but I couldn't move. Instead, I stayed hidden behind a row of cars, clutching the gift bag like a shield. Every instinct in me screamed that nothing would ever be the same again. I crouched slightly, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure someone could hear it. They walked together toward the mall's exit, still laughing, completely unaware that I was just a few feet away. I could see the ease in his body language, the way his hand brushed the small of her back, guiding her as if it were second nature. That simple gesture gutted me more than the kiss. It wasn't just a fling, it was intimacy. I pulled my phone from my purse with trembling hands. My fingers shook as I unlocked it, the screen glowing harsh in the dim light of the lot. For a second I hesitated, asking myself if I really wanted proof of what my eyes had already seen. But then, a surge of clarity hit me. This wasn't about doubt. This was about survival. So I lifted the phone and snapped photo after photo, capturing every cruel detail. Each click of the camera felt like a betrayal carved into stone. My chest was tight, my breaths short, but I kept going until I knew I had enough. I didn't want a confrontation. Not here, not now. No shouting match in the middle of a parking lot. I wanted something more permanent, something that would burn when the time was right. And in that moment, a vow formed inside me. He would regret every single lie. I lowered my phone slowly, my hand still trembling, and pressed it against my chest like it was the only thing holding me together. David's laugh echoed faintly as he walked farther away, his voice mixing with hers, carefree and warm. That sound used to be mine, a melody stitched into the fabric of our life. Now, it was poisoned. Every note of it cut through me, sharp and merciless. For a moment, I just stood there, paralyzed, my whole body humming with disbelief. The parking lot around me blurred, headlights passing, strangers talking, carts clattering against pavement. None of it registered. All I could feel was the weight of betrayal settling deep into my bones. My marriage, my trust, my sense of safety. It all cracked in a single heartbeat. I was no longer the same woman who had walked into the mall that afternoon. But instead of collapsing, I straightened my back. If he thought I'd break, he didn't know me at all. No tears. Not yet. I would carry this storm inside me, quietly, until the moment I chose to let it loose. And as I turned away, clutching the photos like a secret weapon, I knew my silence would be the sharpest blade. When I walked through the front door that evening, David was already home. He looked up from the couch with that same easy smile, as if nothing in the world had shifted. "Long day?" he asked, his voice steady, his tone practiced. I forced a small nod, setting my mother's gift bag on the table, my face calm. Inside, though, it felt like a storm had taken root in my chest, beating against my ribs with every breath. We sat down for dinner, the same routine as always. Plates, silverware, a soft clink of glasses. He talked about work, about deadlines and meetings, weaving the same excuses he had fed me for weeks. I listened, nodding at the right times, even asking questions, but every word that left his mouth felt like a fresh lie burning the air between us. My hands stayed steady, my smile faint, though inside I was unraveling thread by thread. I studied him differently that night. The way his eyes darted when I asked certain questions, the slight pause before he gave an answer. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was confirmation, layered over confirmation. And I matched his performance with my own, giving him no reason to suspect that I already knew, that I had seen, that I had proof. My silence became my armor, and he had no idea how dangerous that really was. The next morning, while David showered, I sifted through the pockets of his jacket hanging carelessly by the door. My fingers brushed over folded receipts, small scraps of his so-called late nights. A bar tab. A boutique purchase I never received. Each slip of paper was a thread, and together they wove the story he thought he'd hidden. I tucked them away, careful not to disturb a thing. My heart pounded, but my face would later wear only calm. At work, I found myself replaying the parking lot scene in my mind like a cruel film. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the kiss, the way she touched him, the lightness in his laugh. But instead of spiraling, I let it fuel me. I started saving his text notifications when they flashed on the screen, memorizing his excuses, building a collection of truths he didn't know I had. Quietly, piece by piece, I was constructing the puzzle. When I returned home, he kissed my cheek like always, oblivious. I smiled back, my mask flawless. But inside, I was already steps ahead. Every lie he told I stored away, carefully labeled and locked in my mind. And as he carried on with his performance, I began to picture the day I'd flipped the script. The day I'd finally let the truth speak louder than his rehearsed lines. By the end of the week, my folder of quiet evidence had grown heavy. The photos from the parking lot sat at the center, cold and undeniable, but now they were surrounded by screenshots, receipts, and carefully observed patterns. Every time David looked at me across the dinner table, I wondered if he could sense the trap forming beneath his feet. But no. He was too wrapped up in his own web, convinced I was still the blind, trusting wife. At night, I'd lie awake listening to his steady breathing, the rise and fall of his chest beside me. I wondered how many times he had come home from her arms straight into mine. The thought burned, but I didn't let it consume me. Instead, I stored it like firewood, fuel for when the time came to burn everything down. My silence was no longer weakness. It was strategy. I started to notice how ordinary life looked from the outside. Neighbors waving, friends checking in, the two of us appearing solid. But behind closed doors, I held the truth like a blade, sharp and ready. He had no idea how close his downfall was, no clue that every step he took was leading him straight into my hands. And soon, I would decide exactly how and when to let him fall. When I suggested hosting a family dinner, David's face lit up. He thought it was my way of showing affection, of reminding everyone that we were still the perfect couple. I played my part beautifully, brushing his hand in public, leaning in close, whispering little endearments that made his parents smile. Inside, I was ice. Every sweet gesture was rehearsed, every smile sharpened into a weapon he couldn't see coming. I invited his parents, his closest friends, even a few people he admired deeply. To him, it looked like a celebration of us, a showcase of unity. He walked around the house humming, completely unaware that he was preparing for his own humiliation. I set the table with care, polished the wine glasses, and placed candles just so. To the outside world, it was love. To me, it was the stage for a reckoning. The night of the dinner, the house filled with laughter and clinking glasses. David thrived in the spotlight, telling stories, soaking in the admiration. I sat beside him, nodding, laughing, letting him bask. But underneath, my pulse was steady, my mind clear. I knew what was coming, and I savored the anticipation. Every second that passed brought me closer to the moment the mask would shatter. After dinner, I stood and tapped my glass lightly, drawing everyone's attention. I thought it might be nice to share some memories, I said warmly, gesturing toward the screen I had set up earlier. Smiles spread across the table. They were expecting nostalgia, anniversaries, maybe even a romantic tribute. David leaned back in his chair, pride written all over his face, convinced he was about to be celebrated. The slideshow began innocently enough: vacations, birthdays, little moments of us smiling together. People chuckled, clapped, whispered sweet remarks. I watched David out of the corner of my eye, saw him squeeze my hand, utterly convinced of my devotion. He had no idea the ground beneath him was about to give way. I felt my heartbeat steady itself, a strange calm taking over. Then, with one click, the screen changed. Gasps rippled through the room as the parking lot photo appeared. David pressed against another woman, his lips on hers, their intimacy undeniable. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, almost electric. I didn't look at the guests. I didn't need to. My eyes stayed on David, watching the color drain from his face, his pride collapsing in an instant. David's hand slipped from mine as if burned. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The guests shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the screen and him, waiting for some kind of explanation. His mother's fork clattered against her plate. His father's jaw tightened. The air grew so heavy it felt like even the candles flickered under its weight. And there he sat, pale, caught, stripped of the charm he loved to wear. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I let the silence stretch, let him drown in it. Every second that ticked by was a reminder that he no longer controlled the narrative. This wasn't his story anymore. It was mine. He fumbled for words, stammering something about a misunderstanding, but no one believed him. The evidence was right there, larger than life, undeniable. His empire of lies had cracked wide open, and I sat perfectly still, calm, composed, the center of gravity in that room. My heart no longer raced. My breathing was steady. I had waited for this moment, crafted it with patience, and now it was unfolding exactly as I intended. Yet I wasn't finished. The real blow was still waiting, the one that would turn this humiliation into a final, irreversible reckoning. I finally rose from my chair, the weight of every eye in the room shifting to me. "This," I said calmly, gesturing toward the screen, "is what David was doing while telling me he was working late." My voice didn't shake. In fact, it carried stronger than I expected, cutting through the silence like a blade. I saw faces turn toward me, some in shock, others in sympathy. David's eyes pleaded, but I didn't flinch. I reached into my bag and pulled out a neatly folded stack of papers. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," I continued, my tone steady, deliberate. "And I've already moved my things." I slid the divorce documents across the table toward him, watching his hands tremble as he realized this wasn't just public shame. This was the end. His greatest pride, his family's approval, now crumbling in front of him. His mother gasped, his father shifted uncomfortably, and his friends sat in stunned silence. David tried to speak, his voice catching on half-formed words, but I cut him off with a look that said everything. This wasn't a debate. This wasn't a conversation. This was my verdict, and I wanted him to feel every ounce of the disgrace he had so carelessly earned. I turned back to the guests, my voice softer now, but no less firm. "You all deserve to know the truth," I said, my gaze sweeping across the table. For months, he looked me in the eyes and lied, pretending to be the devoted husband. But this, I pointed toward the frozen image on the screen. This is who he really is. A murmur spread through the room, the kind that comes when respect dies in an instant. David's mother covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. His father stared at him with disappointment so raw it almost filled the silence for me. David reached for me across the table, desperate, whispering my name as if it could erase what had been laid bare. I pulled my hand back before he touched me, my refusal loud without a single word. That gesture was final. I stood taller, refusing to let the moment swallow me. This wasn't about rage anymore. It was about reclaiming myself in the brightest, most undeniable way. I had carried his lies quietly, had built the case piece by piece, and now I was free of them. The papers on the table weren't just legal documents. They were my declaration. I was done living in his shadow. I gathered my things slowly, making sure every eye in that room stayed on me. My purse over my shoulder, the gift bag for my mother still in my hand, the one detail of the day that remained pure. I looked at David one last time. His face was ashen, his pride shredded in front of the people whose approval meant everything to him. That, I knew, was the wound that would never heal. I didn't shout, didn't cry, didn't let him see me broken. Instead, I held my head high and walked toward the door. Each step was steady, deliberate, a rhythm that carried me further from the lies and closer to freedom. Behind me, I could hear whispers rising, the rustle of chairs, the stunned disbelief settling into the room. I didn't turn back. Not once. As I stepped into the cool night air, I breathed deeply, as if taking my first full breath in months. The weight on my chest lifted, replaced by something stronger: resolve. David would forever be remembered not as a husband, not as the man he pretended to be, but as the liar who was exposed in front of his own family. And I would be remembered as the woman who refused to be deceived one moment longer.
The day I discovered my grandfather's fortune wasn't lost but hidden was the same day his murderer tried to break into my apartment. I suppose I should have expected it. After all, $2 billion doesn't just disappear without someone noticing. My name is Natalie Chen, and until 3 weeks ago, I was just another overworked architect at a prestigious firm in Manhattan, designing luxury spaces I could never afford. Then my grandfather, the infamous Michael Chen, founder of Pinnacle Investments, died in what police called a robbery gone wrong at his modest Boston apartment. Modest, that was the word that kept appearing in the news reports. How the mighty Michael Chen, once worth billions before his company's spectacular collapse 5 years ago, had been living in a one-bedroom apartment, apparently penniless after investor lawsuits and government fines had stripped him of everything. The funeral was small, attended mainly by distant relatives, hoping against hope that the old man had squirreled away something for them. My Uncle Richard, who had been my grandfather's right-hand man at Pinnacle before the collapse, delivered a eulogy that sounded more like a business presentation, complete with thinly veiled references to lessons learned and the price of ambition. I sat in the back row, uncomfortable in the only black dress I owned, watching my relatives size each other up as potential rivals. None of them had spoken to my grandfather in years. None except me. Miss Chen. The lawyer approached me after the service, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his handshake firm but not aggressive. Martin Wells, I handled your grandfather's affairs. He left something for you. Richard materialized beside us, his eyes narrowing. Martin, I wasn't aware my father left anything for anyone. Just a few personal effects, Wells replied smoothly. Nothing of financial value. Richard's disappointment was palpable. Well, Natalie hardly needs keepsakes. She saw him every Sunday for the past 5 years while the rest of us were dealing with the fallout from his crimes. I met my uncle's gaze steadily. Those Sunday visits meant something to him. And to me. How touching, Richard sneered. Did he happen to mention during those touching visits where the missing investor funds went? $2 billion doesn't just vanish. He was found innocent of theft, I reminded him, though the words sounded hollow even to me. The courts have ruled that my grandfather hadn't stolen the money, but they never determined what had happened to it either. Pinnacle's collapse remained one of the greatest unsolved financial mysteries of the decade. Wells cleared his throat. If you'll come by my office tomorrow, Miss Chen, we can handle the paperwork. The personal effects turned out to be disappointingly mundane. My grandfather's collection of first edition mystery novels, his chess set, and an old worn peacoat that seemed at odds with the crisp suits I always remembered him wearing. He was very specific that these items go to you, Wells said, sliding the paperwork across his desk. I ran my fingers over the soft wool of the peacoat. This doesn't even look like something he would wear. Your grandfather changed considerably after Pinnacle's collapse, Wells offered. Perhaps his tastes simplified along with his circumstances. I nodded, though something felt off. Grandfather had been many things, but simple was never one of them. That night in my apartment, I examined the items more carefully. The books were beautiful but unremarkable. No hidden messages or secret codes jumped out from their pages. The chess set was the same one we'd played with during my Sunday visits, each piece familiar under my fingers. The coat was the puzzle. I held it up, studying the worn elbows and frayed cuffs. It looked like something a dock worker might wear, not the man who had once graced the cover of Forbes. As I ran my hands over it, I felt something strange in the lining, a stiffness that shouldn't be there. Using a pair of small scissors, I carefully cut along the inner seam. Inside the lining was a thin, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. Property is merely a concept, the first page began, and concepts can be reimagined. I stayed up all night reading the journal, my hands trembling as I turned each page. It wasn't a confession or an apology. It was a roadmap. The $2 billion hadn't been stolen, it had been hidden, converted into physical and digital assets scattered across the globe using a complex system of transactions that left no paper trail. The journal detailed everything: locations, access codes, conversion protocols. But more chilling were the names. My grandfather had identified 6 key people he believed had orchestrated Pinnacle's downfall. He called them the architects, and my Uncle Richard was one of them. They thought they were destroying me, my grandfather wrote. They didn't realize they were setting a trap that would take years to spring. The final entry was dated just 3 days before his death. Everything is in place. Natalie will understand what to do. She always sees the patterns others miss. A sharp knock at my door made me jump. It was 3 a.m., too late for visitors. Through the peephole, I saw Richard standing in the hallway, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled, his eyes darting nervously. "Natalie, open up. I need to talk to you about the will." I quickly hid the journal under my sofa cushions. "It's the middle of the night, Richard. It's important. Your grandfather, there might be more to his estate than Wells let on." My hand froze on the doorknob. How would Richard know that unless? "I can come back tomorrow," I called through the door, making a split-second decision not to let him in. "This can't wait," he insisted, his voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. "Open the door, Natalie." Instead, I quietly gathered the journal, my phone, and my wallet, shoving them into a backpack along with some clothes. The fire escape outside my bedroom window wasn't ideal, but it beat facing whatever had brought my uncle to my door at this hour. As I climbed down the metal stairs, I heard the splintering of wood above me. Richard hadn't been alone, and they weren't waiting for an invitation. I spent that night in a 24-hour diner, nursing endless cups of coffee as I read and reread the journal, trying to understand what my grandfather expected me to do with this information. By morning, I had a plan, or at least the beginning of one. The journal's first set of coordinates led me to a small bank in Zurich where a safe deposit box contained exactly what my grandfather promised: bearer bonds worth $50 million. A USB drive, and a set of keys. "Your grandfather said you would come," the bank manager told me as he led me to the private viewing room. He was very specific about the timing. "The timing?" The manager checked his watch. "Yes," he said, "if you arrived before today, I was to turn you away. If you never came, the contents would be donated to charity next month. But if you arrived precisely between days 18 and 25 after his death, I was to give you full access." 18 to 25 days, specific enough to be deliberate. But why that time frame? The USB drive provided the answer. It contained surveillance footage from my grandfather's apartment on the night of his murder. The timestamp showed 2:17 a.m. as a figure in dark clothing entered through the balcony door. My grandfather, surprisingly alert for that hour, didn't seem shocked by the intrusion. Right on schedule, I heard him say in the footage. Richard always was punctual, even for a murder. The camera captured everything: my uncle's face as he removed his mask, their conversation about the missing billions, and finally, the moment when Richard plunged a knife into my grandfather's chest. "You'll never find it," my grandfather gasped as he fell. "I don't need to," Richard replied coldly. "Once you're dead, I can take my time searching. No one else knows it exists." But my grandfather had known this was coming. He had planned for it. The 18-day delay suddenly made sense. It was the exact amount of time the police would hold the crime scene before releasing the apartment back to the estate, which Richard controlled as executor. My grandfather had given me a head start, but not a large one. If I had understood the journal correctly, there were 5 more locations, 5 more pieces to recover before I could fully unravel what my grandfather had done with the missing billions, and more importantly, prove who had really been behind Pinnacle's collapse. The second location took me to Singapore, where a seemingly ordinary painting in a private gallery contained microscopic etchings that, when viewed under a special lens included with the safe deposit box contents, revealed account numbers and passwords to digital assets worth hundreds of millions. In Hong Kong, a storage unit rented under a false name contained hard drives with evidence implicating 3 more of the architects in a conspiracy to manipulate markets and destroy Pinnacle from within. With each discovery, I pieced together my grandfather's true narrative. He hadn't been the villain in Pinnacle's collapse, he had been the scapegoat. The 6 architects, his most trusted executives and partners, had orchestrated the company's downfall, siphoning off assets and manufacturing evidence that pointed to my grandfather. But instead of fighting back immediately, he had disappeared the remaining assets, bided his time, and meticulously documented everything. He had created an elaborate posthumous revenge, with me as its executor. By the time I reached the 4th location, a small law firm in London, Richard had figured out what was happening. My hotel room was ransacked while I was out. A man in a dark suit followed me through Piccadilly Circus. Anonymous threats arrived by text message. "You're in over your head," Natally, Richard himself finally called to tell me. "Your grandfather was a manipulative old man who's using you as a pawn from beyond the grave. Whatever you think you're doing, stop now." "Before you kill me too?" I asked. A pause. "I don't know what you think you know, but you're making dangerous accusations." "I have the footage, Richard, from grandfather's apartment. He knew you were coming." Another, longer pause. "Then you understand this isn't a game. $2 billion buys a lot of influence, Natalie. People far more powerful than you want this to stay buried. Is that why you killed him? For the money?" "I killed him because he was going to expose everything. The money is just an insurance policy." His voice hardened. "Walk away now, and you can keep what you found so far. More than enough for a comfortable life." But I had seen my grandfather's full plan now, and it was breathtaking in its complexity and justice. The final 2 locations would complete the puzzle, revealing not just the remaining assets but putting into motion a sequence of information releases that would expose the architects to regulatory agencies worldwide. It was never about the money for him, I realized aloud. It was about the truth. Richard laughed bitterly. Michael always did know how to dress up greed as principle. "Don't be naive." But as I followed the trail my grandfather had left, moving from London to Dubai to a remote island in the Caribbean, I came to understand that my grandfather's plan went beyond personal revenge. He had created a financial dead man's switch. If executed correctly, it would not only expose the conspiracy that destroyed Pinnacle but would return the missing funds to the investors who had lost everything. The final location was the most surprising of all, my grandfather's modest Boston apartment. According to his journal, he had hidden the master key to the entire system in plain sight, somewhere even Richard would never think to look. Returning to Boston was dangerous, but I had no choice. Richard would surely be watching the apartment, knowing it contained the final piece. I needed a distraction. Using the resources my grandfather had left me, I orchestrated simultaneous information leaks to financial authorities in 3 countries, each containing partial evidence against the architects. As expected, the resulting chaos, including the arrest of 2 of Richard's co-conspirators, drew his attention away from Boston long enough for me to slip into the apartment. The place had been thoroughly searched, furniture overturned, walls opened, floors pulled up. Whatever hiding place my grandfather had chosen had withstood Richard's desperate attempts to find it. I stood in the center of the destruction, trying to think like my grandfather. Where would you hide something so important that even someone who knew you well wouldn't find it? The answer came as I remembered our Sunday chess games. My grandfather had always said that the best hiding place was one disguised as something else, something so familiar that no one would think to question it. The chess set from his personal effects, the one I'd inherited. Back in my hotel room, I examined each piece carefully until I found it, the black king with a nearly imperceptible seam around its base. Twisting it revealed a small compartment containing a microchip and a handwritten note. Natally, if you're reading this, you've solved the puzzle as I knew you would. The final key is encoded in the microchip, but it will only activate when synchronized with the other 5 components you've collected. Once activated, the system will transfer the remaining assets to the recovery fund for Pinnacle's investors and release the complete evidence package to authorities worldwide. Richard and the others will have nowhere to hide. I'm sorry for putting this burden on you, but you were the only one I could trust. The only one who saw me as a person, not a fortune. The world believed I stole billions, but the truth is, I've spent 5 years ensuring those billions would find their way back to their rightful owners, while those truly responsible face justice. You have a choice now. Activate the system as I've designed it, or walk away with what you've already found. I would understand either decision, but know that you were never a pawn. You were always my queen, the most powerful piece on the board. With love and faith, Grandfather. That night, as I connected the microchip to the assembled system, I thought about choices and consequences. My grandfather had spent 5 years in exile, bearing the world's hatred, working toward this moment of posthumous vindication. Richard had killed to protect a fortune built on betrayal, and I had followed a trail of breadcrumbs that led to this moment of decision. The system activated with a simple command: justice, not vengeance. Within hours, financial news outlets worldwide were reporting the sensational return of the missing Pinnacle funds, accompanied by irrefutable evidence of the conspiracy that had destroyed the company. Richard and the remaining architects were arrested as they attempted to flee the country. 6 months later, I stood at my grandfather's grave, now marked with a simple headstone rather than the unmarked plot Richard had hastily arranged. You should have trusted me while you were alive, I told him, placing a chess piece, the Black King, on top of the stone. We could have done this together. The wind rustled through the cemetery trees, and for a moment, I could almost hear his voice. You've always seen the patterns others miss. I smiled despite the tears forming. The inheritance my grandfather had left wasn't the money, all of which had gone back to the investors as he intended. It was something far more valuable. The truth, meticulously documented and preserved against all odds. As I walked away, my phone buzzed with a notification from Martin Wells. There was one final item in my grandfather's estate, a small property in the mountains that had somehow been overlooked in the initial accounting. Nothing valuable, Wells assured me. Just a cabin he purchased after Pinnacle's collapse. But legally, it's yours now. Something told me this wasn't an oversight, but the final move in my grandfather's grand design. What would I find there? Another puzzle? A simple place of retreat, or perhaps just a note saying goodbye? Whatever awaited me in the mountains, I knew one thing for certain. My grandfather had reimagined the concept of inheritance. He hadn't left me wealth or status or power. Instead, he had left me the most valuable asset of all, the chance to rewrite history with the truth. And that was a responsibility I would never take lightly. I was 36 years old when I found the letter that destroyed everything I thought I knew about my family. It was yellowed and brittle, hidden between the pages of my grandmother's Bible, a place sacred enough that no one would dare disturb it, yet accessible enough to be found by the right person at the right time. That person apparently was me. My name is Eleanor Winters, and until that rainy Tuesday afternoon in April, I was the chief archivist at the Westbrook Historical Society, a position I had held with quiet pride for nearly a decade. My job was to preserve the stories of others, to catalog and protect the fragments of lives long past. I never expected to uncover a secret that would rewrite my own history. Eleanor, are you still here? Martin's voice echoed through the empty museum halls. As the director, he was accustomed to finding me working late, surrounded by documents long after everyone else had gone home. In the storage room, I called back, carefully placing my grandmother's Bible into an acid-free box. I had brought it in to properly preserve it after finding it while clearing out her house. She had passed away 3 months earlier at 92, leaving me as the last of the Winters line, or so I had believed. Martin appeared in the doorway, his bow tie slightly askew as always. It's almost 8. Even dedicated archivists need to eat dinner. I held up the letter, my hand trembling slightly. I found something. In my grandmother's Bible. Family recipe? Secret romance? He smiled, then noticed my expression. "Eleanor, what is it?" "A letter from my grandmother to someone named Clara Bennett, dated June 4, 1956. I swallowed hard. "It's about a baby. My mother, I think." "Except?" "Except what?" "Except my grandmother wasn't supposed to have given birth to my mother. She adopted her. That's what I've been told my entire life." I looked up at Martin, the museum's dim emergency lights casting shadows across his concerned face. "This letter suggests otherwise. It says, the baby is healthy and beautiful. No one will ever know she isn't Lawrence's. Your sacrifice has saved us all." Martin pulled up a chair beside me. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying my grandmother had an affair, got pregnant, and then convinced her best friend to pretend the baby, my mother, was hers. Then she and my grandfather adopted their own biological grandchild and raised her as their daughter." The words sounded absurd as I said them, like the plot of a melodramatic novel rather than my family history. "That's quite a revelation," Martin said carefully. "What will you do?" I folded the letter along its well-worn creases. "What I always do. Research. There's more to this story, and if there's one thing I know how to do, it's follow a historical paper trail." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I spread my grandmother's papers across my dining room table. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, photographs, journals, all the materials I had collected after her death but had been too grief-stricken to properly examine. With trained eyes, I began to see the inconsistencies I had missed before. Dates that didn't quite align, unexplained gaps in correspondence, photographs where my grandmother's smile seemed forced. By morning, I had formulated a hypothesis and a research plan. If Clara Bennett had pretended to be pregnant while my grandmother actually was, there would be records, doctor's visits, hospital stays, perhaps even newspaper announcements. And if Clara had then given her baby to my grandparents to raise, there would be adoption papers. For the first time in my career, I called in sick to the museum. This was personal research that couldn't wait. The county records office was housed in a brutalist concrete building that always reminded me of a mausoleum, fitting perhaps for an institution that preserved the official documentation of lives no longer lived. I knew the clerk well, having spent countless hours researching local families for museum exhibits. "Birth records for Clara Bennett," he repeated, peering at me over his glasses. "That's going back a ways. And it's not related to a museum project." "Family research," I said, the half-truth bitter on my tongue. "My grandmother mentioned a Clara Bennett as an old friend. I'm trying to piece together some family history." 3 hours later, I had my answer, or at least part of it. There was no record of Clara Bennett giving birth in 1956. There was, however, a marriage certificate for Clara Bennett and George Carter dated 1955, and a death certificate for Clara Carter dated December 1956, cause of death, hemorrhage following childbirth. My hands shook as I requested the birth certificate for the Carter baby. When it arrived, the name listed was simply Baby Girl Carter, with no first name recorded. Father, George Carter. Mother, Clara Carter, née Bennett. Was the baby adopted? I asked the clerk. Would those records be available? He shook his head. Adoption records from that era are sealed unless you're directly involved. You'd need a court order or consent from the adoptee. I thanked him and left, my mind racing. If Clara had died in childbirth, she couldn't have been the woman who pretended to be pregnant with my mother. And if there was no record of my grandmother giving birth that year, the next logical step was to find George Carter. It took 2 weeks of determined research, but I finally located him in a retirement community 50 miles away. At 89, George Carter was still sharp-minded, though his body was frail. When I called to request a meeting, explaining only that I was researching Clara Bennett's family connections, he agreed immediately. "Not many people remember Clara anymore," he said, his voice wavering over the phone. "I'd be happy to talk about her." The retirement community was pleasant, with wide hallways and abundant natural light. George waited for me in a common area, a photo album open on the table before him. He was thin and stooped, with liver-spotted hands and clear blue eyes that reminded me, with a jolt, of my own. "Mr. Carter," I began after we'd exchanged pleasantries, "thank you for meeting with me. As I mentioned, I'm researching Clara Bennett, your first wife." "Clara," he said softly, touching a black and white photograph of a smiling young woman with dark hair. The love of my life, even after all these years. I understand she died in childbirth, I said gently. I'm very sorry. He nodded, grief still evident in his expression decades later. It was sudden. Complications no one expected. One moment we were celebrating the birth of our daughter, and the next. He trailed off, then regained his composure. But you didn't come here to listen to an old man's sorrows. What do you want to know about Clara? I hesitated, uncertain how to broach the subject delicately. I'm interested in what happened to your daughter. His expression changed, becoming guarded. Why would you be asking about that? I took a deep breath and placed my grandmother's letter on the table between us. Because I found this. It was written by my grandmother, Margaret Winters, to Clara. It suggests some sort of arrangement involving a baby. George stared at the letter for a long moment, then looked up at me, really seeing me for the first time. You have her eyes, he said quietly. Clara's eyes. What are you saying? I whispered though I already knew. Margaret and Clara were best friends since childhood, he began, closing the photo album. When Clara found out she was expecting, Margaret was the first person she told. They shared everything. He paused, collecting his thoughts. Around the same time, Margaret discovered she was pregnant too. The timing was significant. Because the baby wasn't her husband's, I supplied. George nodded. Lawrence Winters was overseas with the military. Margaret had formed an attachment with someone else. When Lawrence returned unexpectedly, she knew her indiscretion would be discovered once the baby arrived. The timing wouldn't work. So what happened? I pressed, though the outline of the story was becoming horrifyingly clear. Clara offered a solution. She would claim to be carrying twins. When the babies were born, she would keep one as her own, and Margaret would adopt the other, her biological child, claiming it was Clara's baby that they had adopted out of friendship after Clara found herself with 2 infants and a modest income. But Clara died, I said. Yes. His voice cracked, and in the confusion and grief that followed, Margaret took both babies, her own, as planned, and Clara's daughter as well. She and Lawrence adopted them both as supposed twins. They named them Rose and Elizabeth. The names hit me like a physical blow. Rose was my mother. Elizabeth was her twin sister, who had died in a car accident when they were 19, long before I was born. So my mother and her sister weren't actually twins. They weren't even related. No, George said. Rose was Margaret's biological daughter. Elizabeth was mine and Clara's. Did they know, my mother and Elizabeth? No, Margaret and Lawrence raised them as their own, as twins, as sisters in every way that mattered. Margaret always intended to tell them when they were old enough. But then Elizabeth died so young, and after that, he spread his hands. Margaret thought it would only cause pain to reveal the truth. And you? I couldn't keep the accusation from my voice. You just let my grandparents take your daughter. Pain flickered across his weathered face. I was shattered by Clara's death. I couldn't care for a newborn alone. Margaret promised to give Elizabeth a good home, to love her as her own. She swore I could be part of her life, and I was, as Uncle George, the family friend who sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts. Did my grandfather know? Lawrence? George shook his head. No, Margaret maintained the fiction that both girls were Clara's, and that they had adopted them after her death. Lawrence never questioned it. I sat back, trying to absorb everything. So my mother wasn't actually a Winters at all. No, George agreed. Biologically, Rose, your mother, was Margaret's child with a man named James Caldwell. He never knew about the pregnancy. He moved away, married someone else. Is he still alive? No, he died about 15 years ago. I nodded, feeling strangely numb. And Elizabeth, she was your daughter. My mother's twin was actually your child. Yes. George reached into his pocket and withdrew a worn photograph, handing it to me. It showed 2 teenage girls with their arms around each other, laughing at the camera. This is the last picture I have of them together, before Elizabeth's accident. I stared at the photo, at these 2 girls who had grown up believing they were twin sisters, when one was my biological grandmother's daughter and the other the daughter of the woman sitting across from me. They looked so happy, so unaware of the complex deception that had shaped their very existence. Why are you telling me all this now? I asked. You could have denied everything, claimed the letter was misinterpreted. George smiled sadly. Because you came looking for the truth. Because you have Clara's eyes. Because secrets like this poison families across generations. He reached out and covered my hand with his. And because I'm 89 years old, Eleanor, I've carried this secret for over 60 years. I'm tired. As I drove home, my mind swirled with implications. My mother had died believing she was someone she wasn't. I was not who I thought I was. The Winters name, which I had worn with such pride, wasn't even my biological heritage. At home, I spread the photographs across my dining room table again, seeing them with new eyes. There was my grandmother, Margaret, young and beautiful, her smile not forced but guilty. There was Uncle George, standing at the edge of family gatherings, watching Elizabeth, his daughter, grow up from a distance. There were my mother and her sister, inseparable until death, never knowing they weren't biological sisters at all. And there was me, the archivist, the preserver of stories, who had failed to read the silences and omissions in my own family narrative. 3 days later, I returned to work. Martin found me cataloging a collection of Civil War letters, my white-gloved hands moving with practiced precision. "Are you okay?" he asked. "You seem different." I considered the question carefully. Was I okay? My entire understanding of my family history had been appended. The grandmother I had revered had carried out an elaborate deception. My mother had lived and died never knowing her true parentage, and somewhere in my genes ran the blood of a stranger named James Caldwell, not Lawrence Winters. "I'm processing," I said finally. "It turns out we're all unreliable narrators of our own histories." "Did you find what you were looking for?" Martin asked. "I found more than I expected," I replied. "I found that even the most carefully preserved archives can contain significant gaps." That evening, I drove back to the retirement community. George Carter was waiting for me, a small wooden box on his lap. "These belong to Clara," he said, opening it to reveal a pearl necklace, a few letters, and a small diary. "I think she would want her granddaughter to have them." "Her granddaughter," I repeated, testing the words. "Yes," George said firmly. "Elizabeth was your aunt in every way that matters, which makes me," he trailed off, suddenly uncertain. "Family," I finished for him. "Complicated, unexpected family." He smiled, relief evident in his expression. "I never thought I'd have the chance to know Clara's family line. After Elizabeth died, I assumed that connection was lost forever." I sat beside him, and together we looked through Clara's belongings. This woman I had never known but whose best friend's secret had altered the course of my family forever. As George told me stories about Clara, her laugh, her love of poetry, her dream of traveling to Paris, I began to see the outlines of a new understanding of family, one that embraced the messy, complicated truth rather than the sanitized fiction my grandmother had created. 2 months later, the Westbrook Historical Society unveiled a new exhibit, Hidden Histories, The Untold Stories of Westbrook Families. Among the displays was a section on the Bennett Carter Winters connection, complete with photographs, letters, and a family tree showing the complex interweaving of these lives. "Are you sure about including your own family in the exhibit?" Martin had asked when I proposed it. "Yes," I had replied. "As archivists, we talk about the importance of preserving the past, of ensuring that stories aren't lost. But we rarely acknowledge how selective those preservations can be, how families curate their own narratives, deciding what to remember and what to forget." The night before the exhibit opened, I stood alone in the gallery, looking at the photographs of Margaret, Clara, Rose, and Elizabeth, the women whose choices and circumstances had shaped my existence in ways I was only beginning to understand. My grandmother had preserved a fiction she believed was necessary. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps the truth would have caused more pain than healing for my mother and Elizabeth. But as I stood there, surrounded by the evidence of lives complexly lived, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. As an archivist, I had dedicated my life to preserving the stories of others. Now I had uncovered and preserved the complicated truth of my own family. There was a certain symmetry to that, a rightness that transcended the shock and betrayal I had initially felt. George attended the opening of the exhibit, frail but determined, his eyes bright as he saw Clara's photograph displayed prominently, her story finally told. Visitors moved through the exhibit, murmuring about the unexpected connections, the secret adoptions, the hidden pregnancies, all the messy humanity that official records so often fail to capture. "Your grandmother would have hated this," George whispered to me, a hint of mischief in his voice. Probably, I agreed. But I think she also would have understood it. She was protecting people she loved. Now I'm honoring them. All of them, by telling their complete story. Later that night, at home, I opened Clara's diary for the first time. Her handwriting was delicate but determined, filling the pages with observations about her daily life, her hopes for her unborn child, her deep friendship with Margaret. On the final page she had written, "Life rarely gives us simple choices. Sometimes the best we can do is to act with love and trust that future generations will understand, even if they cannot forgive." I ran my fingers over the words, this message from a woman I had never known, but whose choices had rippled through time to shape my very existence. Clara couldn't have imagined that 60 years later, her best friend's granddaughter would read these words, seeking understanding for a deception that had defined 3 generations. In my professional life, I had always believed that archives existed to preserve the truth. Now I understood that they preserved a version of the truth, selected, curated, sometimes sanitized. The messy reality of human lives often existed in the spaces between official records, in the silences and omissions in the stories families told themselves. As an archivist, I had failed to read those silences in my own family history, as Eleanor Winters, or was it Eleanor Caldwell? Or perhaps Eleanor Carter, in honor of the grandfather I had discovered so late in life. I was learning to listen to them, to hear what remained unsaid, and to find peace in the complicated, imperfect truth. 6 months after discovering my grandmother's letter, I stood beside George Carter's hospital bed, holding his frail hand as he drifted in and out of consciousness. At 90, his body was finally failing him. "Clara," he murmured, his eyes opening slightly. "Clara, I've missed you." "It's Eleanor," I said gently, squeezing his hand. He smiled weakly. "I know, but you have her eyes." As his breathing slowed, I thought about the strange journey that had brought me here, to the bedside of a man who was both a stranger and family, linked to me through a complex web of secrets, choices, and consequences that spanned decades. "Thank you," I whispered as he slipped away, "for helping me find the truth." In the end, I realized that's what archives and families are supposed to do. Preserve what came before so that those who follow can understand their place in the continuing story. My grandmother had tried to rewrite history, believing she was protecting those she loved. But some stories insist on being told, emerging from forgotten Bibles and dusty photographs, demanding acknowledgement. As the newly appointed director of the Westbrook Historical Society, Martin had retired 2 weeks earlier. I had made it my mission to seek out these hidden narratives, to ensure that the archives we maintained reflected the messy, complicated reality of human lives, not just the sanitized versions families often prefer to remember. The last Winters had become the first Carter in 3 generations, and in that transformation, I had found not just a new understanding of my past, but a clearer vision for my future, as an archivist, as a granddaughter, as a keeper of complicated truths. Some might call it betrayal. This public exposure of family secrets, I prefer to think of it as the highest form of remembrance, acknowledging those who came before us not as perfect figures in carefully curated photographs, but as real people who loved, erred, sacrificed, and did their imperfect best to protect what mattered most. In the archive of my own life, that understanding is perhaps the most valuable document of all.